African Americans Y chromosome sparks shift in evolutionary timetable by Alan Boyle, science direct editor at NBC News. So it says here, scientists say an African American male's odd genetic signature suggests that the human Y chromosome's lineage goes back further in time than they thought, perhaps due to interbreeding with other populations such as Neanderthal. Alright, so we gotta dodge that hijack because it's from research it's appearing more that the descendants of Japhet were the ones who actually interbred with Neanderthals, interbreeding. This really upsets a lot of ideas, but at the same time, it's understandable if we accept that human populations were structured in the past so that there were little pockets of diversity, said Michael Hammer, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Arizona who is one of the authors of a study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. The study focuses on the analysis of a DNA sample that was obtained from an African American living in South Carolina and submitted to the Genographic Project, a National Geographic effort aimed at mapping human origins and migration. The funny thing about this sample is that it didn't match up with any of the previously known genetic signatures for the Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son. Alright, so do you understand what they're saying? It's saying that his DNA doesn't match what they have in their records, in their Y chromosome database. Alright, his is unique. This African, so-called African American living in South Carolina, America. Continues, says nobody expected to find anything like this, Hammer said in a news release. A team led by Fernando Mendez, a researcher in Hammer's lab, analyzed more than 240,000 DNA base pairs on the African American's Y chromosome. A comparison of the differences between the mystery genetic signature and previously known signatures led the team to conclude that the most recent common ancestor for the entire group lived about 338,000 years ago. Okay, according to them. That goes further back than fossil records goes for anatomically modern humans, Hammer said. Alright, you're hearing that, right? The fossils records speak to 195,000 years or 200,000 years, he said. It also goes further back than previous date for the most recent common ancestor based on Y chromosome analysis, which is in the range of 142,000 years. So, how significant is that? Because this is what they teach us, right? That first humans, the first anatomically modern humans, and the oldest ancestor with the Y chromosome, is in Africa. That's what they've been teaching us all our life. But this new research, this new analysis of this DNA from this man in South Carolina, this Aboriginal man, right? Copper-colored tribe found here, goes back even further, right? And he's in America, right? This is the true old world. Correlating with this, the new scientist also made some research on this. Basically the same. It says here, the father of all men is 340,000 years old by Colin Barris. Albert Perry, that was the person's name, carried a secret in his DNA, a Y chromosome so distinctive that it reveals new information about the origin of our species. It shows that the last common male ancestor down the paternal line of our species is over twice as old as we thought. Alright, twice as old, found in America. One possible explanation is that hundreds of thousands of years ago, modern and archaic humans in Central Africa interbred, adding to the known examples of interbreeding with Neanderthals in the Middle East and with the enigmatic Denisovans somewhere in Southeast Asia. So we gotta dodge the hijack because they still trying to throw in the African in there, right? Because he's African American, right? Copper colored person in America, they have to somehow try to relate it to Africa. But he is the oldest, proven to be the oldest, carrying this Y chromosome, and he's in South Carolina. Continuing, it says Perry, recently deceased, was an African American who lived in South Carolina. A few years ago, one of his female relatives submitted a sample of his DNA to a company called Family Tree DNA for genealogical analysis. Genetics can use such samples to work out how we are related to one another. Hundreds of thousands of people have now had their DNA tested. The data from these tests have shown that all men gained their Y chromosome from a common male ancestor. This genetic atom lived between 60,000 and 140,000 years ago. All men except Perry, that is. So stop right there. They're telling you, we thought all men descended from one common ancestor, right? 140,000 years ago, which they teach us was in Africa. But all men except Perry, right? That is, right? When family tree DNA technicians tried to place Perry on the Y chromosome family tree, they just couldn't. His Y chromosome was like no other so far analyzed. Deeper roots, it says here. Michael Hammer, geneticist at the University of Arizona, Tucson, heard about Perry's unusual Y chromosome and did some further testing. His team research revealed something extraordinary. Perry did not descend from the genetic atom. In fact, his Y chromosome was so distinct that his male lineage probably separated from all others about 338,000 years ago. Alright? I mean, we gotta be careful when they say this genetic atom, because in their eyes, from what they've taught us all our lives, the genetic atom came out of Africa. But they don't really know if that was the atom. They're just calling it the first male or first person genetic atom. But the old world is on this side. I told you, the Hebrews are over here. So where does the genetic atom really start? And how far ago? As you can see, they traced it back to an indigenous, copper-colored, tribal person from this side of the world, America, not Africa. Let's continue. So I'm going to read from this book. It's called The Ancient Mystic Oriental Masonry. Its teachings, rules, laws, present usages which govern the order of the present day. True Masonry and the Universal Brotherhood of Man are one, it says here. You can see the symbols they're using, for those of you who know. By Dr. R. Swinburne Clymer, author of the Rosicrucians, Their Teachings of Philosophy and Fire, and etc. Alright, so in this book, just wanted to show a couple of things here to correlate what we've been learning about the true old world. It says the cradle of the symbolism used in all masonry is placed by many of the best authorities in that country which they believe was first inhabited. For example, the plateau of Tartary, and from there transmitted to this generation by the sages of India, Persia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. But then look what it says. It says, we are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. So he's saying how they believe that all these symbolism came out of Egypt, and that from there it was spread to those other places like India and Persia. But it says we are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. It is a fact that at Memphis, Egypt, in the pyramids, under the guidance of the kings of the mystic rites of masonry, were worked many thousands of years ago. But at that time, Egypt and the continent of America were one and the same. Alright, so when they're talking about Memphis, Egypt, what Memphis are they talking about? Are they talking about Memphis in America? The real Egypt? We're about to read that right now. So listen to what they're saying. It says, in America, rediscovered in the 15th century and repopulated in the 17th, was recovered Egypt and the promised land. Alright? Egypt and the promised land. The promised land, right? The ancient Hebrews. Or the land of the constellation of the eagle. And continuing this book, it says, and secondly, with the consequent wrecking of the continent of America, when the globe became involved in the consequences of the disorder of the skies, America, known to the mystic as Atlantis, when this ruin befell, was the seat of the greatest empire that has ever existed, and its irresistible armies were terrorizing all Europe and Asia. Alright, they're talking about America. Study of the American constellations Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Capricornus reveals the immemorial antiquity of the name of America and the significance of the arms of the United States. The fact once recognized that it is impossible to separate the eagle from America, the land shadowed with wings of Isaiah. Alright? When following the course of the constellations, those immovably and perpetually fastened upon America are reached, it will appear that while all that is sublime in the historic past centers upon Egypt, all that is sublime in the prehistoric past centers upon America. Atlantis, and as the curtain which has hitherto concealed a prehistoric connection between the peoples of ancient Egypt and of America is lifted, it will be seen that the people of the eagle on the Nile being descended from the original people of the eagle on this continent. The twain are one in that prehistoric America was the original Egypt or Eagle Land prior to the mighty expansion in the days of Peleg, when the earth was divided and the great globe itself was nearly rent asunder. Again, that prehistoric America was the original Egypt, alright? The original Egypt was here in America, alright? And as I said right there, right before, it says that all that is sublime in historic past centers upon Egypt, right? Of what they think of Egypt as today, but all that is sublime in the prehistoric past centers upon America or Atlantis, alright? The old original Egypt. Continuing in this book, it says Agassiz, firstborn among continents, America, has been falsely denominated the New World. Hers was the first dry land lifted out of the waters. Hers was the first shore washed by the ocean that enveloped all the earths besides. So hers was the first land lifted out of the waters. You hearing that? And while Europe was represented only by islands rising here and there above the sea, alright, Europe was only islands. America or Atlantis already stretched in an unbroken line of land from Nova Scotia to the far west. Others, judging from the similarity of those religious rites, have conjectured that it was peopled by the 10 tribes at the dispersion of Israel. Some think it received its population from China or Japan. Others that it was colonized by some wandering tribes of Japhet, who penetrated into the trackless regions of North America by the Straits of Asia. Some have been bold enough to assert that America was not inundated at the deluge, and that consequently the Aborigines were antediluvians and the most ancient people on earth, which last assertion is correct. So he's telling us, this author, is that this last idea is the correct one. And we just read, right, how the oldest Y chromosome was dated back to a man in South Carolina, a so-called African American, a copper-colored aboriginal, indigenous person of America. And as it correlates here, it's the antediluvian people, the Aborigines, right? And this is the correct assertion. They didn't all perish or die when part of the land was sunk. Alright, you've been here. Alright, so you just heard from this popular Masonic book. This is what they teach themselves, what they know, and they told you when we talk about prehistory, we're really talking about America / Atlantis, right? So what is older? It tells us that Peru and Egypt was one empire, right? So if you watch my corn videos, you see that agriculture started out in Peru a long time ago. Like the first civilizations, the oldest structures and pyramids ever built were actually in Peru, in the site called Caral Supe. It predates Mesopotamia and the Egyptian dynasties. Alright, so look into it. Also, did you know that the oldest mummies were actually in Chile and Peru and not in Egypt? Since the early 1900s, almost 300 human mummies have been uncovered along the coast of southern Peru and northern Chile, including adults, children, infants, and miscarried fetuses. With some dated to as far back as 50 BC, there are the oldest mummies discovered in the world today. Alright, you hear that? Not in Egypt. They were made by a group of hunter-gatherers known as the Chinchorro people, who were mummifying their dead roughly 2,000 years before the ancient Egyptians began mummifying their pharaohs. The dates that we have for the bodies are from 7,000 years ago. So they have more relative antiquity in terms of international work on the human body than that found in Egypt, says Medina Para. Alright? And in Wikipedia we read, The Chinchorro mummies. The Chinchorro mummies are mummified remains of individuals from the South American Chinchorro culture, found in what is now northern Chile. They are the oldest examples of artificially mummified human remains, having been buried up to 2,000 years before the Egyptian mummies. While the earliest mummy that has been found in Egypt dated around 3000 BC, the oldest anthropogenically modified Chinchorro mummy dates from around 5050 BC. The oldest naturally mummified mummy recovered from the Atacama Desert is dated around 7020 BC. You're hearing that? That's almost 9 to 10,000 years ago, people, right? So, where is the true old world? Shell midden and bone chemistry suggest that 90% of the people's diet was seafood. Many ancient cultures of fisher folk existed, tucked away in the arid river valleys of the Andes. But the Chinchorro made themselves unique by their dedicated preservation of the dead. Alright, so where is the true old world? So I wanted to show you this research and correlation. It's regarding, if you've seen part 1 of my videos of this series, the bones they found here in America, the oldest bone. And one of the older ones they found, and as an example, is this one called Luzia, which was a female, right? So originally I had a better presentation of this because I was using a video documentary. I was showing you the video, but I actually uploaded this video a day before the day that it says I did, but it was blocked by YouTube worldwide. They banned it because I used supposedly the documentary and they gave me a copyright claim, which is false because it's fair use, right? I'm just teaching you guys, I'm just showing you guys so we can have a discussion, so we can learn, right? So either way, what I did is I just used images instead of the video, so I had to re-edit it and re-upload it. So here it is, all right? And this is in Northeast Brazil. It's called Tracking the First Americans. And I just want to show you what they basically determined after their research and their science and scientific anthropology, who these first Americans were. So this particular scientist, in the video, he explains, after he did all the measurements, craniology, what they do to determine what kind of race they might have been. He tells you straight up in the documentary that he didn't believe the findings. He had to re-put the numbers, but when he grabbed these numbers and put them into the computer, it was clearly telling him that it was a Negro, or had Negro features. All right. These scientists, these people researching or analyzing these bones they found, they're not just guessing. They're doing 3D CAT scans they can make a mold, right? Mr. Richard Nee, or Dr. Richard Nee from the University of Manchester in England, the cast was given to him. He's one of the world's leading forensic scientists, so he can do or recreate the features of this bone. A renowned forensic scientist, all right, in England from the University of Manchester. So these are not people guessing, all right. This is not outdated information. Actually, this is new information, all right. So as you can see, how he scaled it. What does that look like? All right. So just to explain a little bit what this forensic scientist is saying in the video. After in this part, he's basically after he's done, he's saying, "This is to me." He's saying it's clearly a Negro face. He said, to me, this is clearly a Negro face. There is nothing in this face or these features that shows him Mongoloid. So it's not Mongoloid at all, according to him. So again, this is you they're talking about. You, the first one who started agriculture, the first one to build pyramids. The Y chromosome dates back to somebody in America, African American. All right, so let's continue. So I keep saying this is the true old world, right? America. If you've heard me say it a bunch of times in my videos, and we've made a connection with, lost tribes of Israel being over here. A lot of correlation to that. You've seen that in my past videos. It seems like a lot of the lands of the Bible, Old Testament, are over here in America. So correlating with what I've been saying, there's this book right here. It's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. This was from New York, Harper and Brothers, Franklin Square in 1882. All right, so I just want to show you maybe this is not such a myth. All right, so let's look into this. It says Atlantis, chapter 1, the purpose of the book. says this book is an attempt to demonstrate several distinct and novel propositions. These are that once existed in the Atlantic Ocean opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea a large island, which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent, and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. That description of this island given by Plato is not, as has been long supposed, fable, but variable history. Alright, it's not fable. That Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. And if you've seen my corn videos, if you haven't, I invite you to go watch them. We see that agriculture helped the first civilizations begin. Agriculture, and it was corn. That's how we can trace corn way back 10,000 years, domesticated by the Native Americans. All right, so this correlates with that. Also, point four, he says that it became in the course of ages a populous and mighty nation, from whose overflowing the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, all the way to the Pacific coast of South America. And what's there? Peru, right? The Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. Point 5, that it was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the gardens of the Hesperides, the Elysian fields, the gardens of Alcinous, the Mesophalos, the Olympus, the Asgard of the traditions, and of the ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. All right, America, right? We're talking about reaching all the way to the Mississippi River, right? That the gods, the goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis. All right, hijacked from the indigenous people of America. All these gods, right? They talk about where did they originate, and the acts attributed to them in mythology are confused recollection of real historical events. That the mythology of Egypt and Peru represent the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship according to them, right? And there was sun worship by some of the tribes that were in America. But we also know that eventually Jehoshua and King David drove some of these sun worshiping tribes out of Jerusalem and Hebron and all these places in the Bible. So yes, it is correlating with what we've read in the Torah. Point 8, that the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. So it says that from America, Atlantis, right? They went over to Egypt that we know today and colonized it there, and that's a colony of Atlantis, not the Egypt. All right, not the original Egypt. That the implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. And if you know about the Michigan mines, you'll see that a lot of the Bronze Age metal that the Greeks and Romans used was coming from America, being mined up there. You can research that. Alright, and it continues, says the Atlanteans were also the first manufacturers of iron. Point 10, that the Phoenician alphabet, parent of all European alphabets, was derived from an Atlantis alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. Like the Atlantis was the original seed of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as the Semitic peoples and possibly also the Turanian races. And if you follow King Drop, you'll see that, there's a lot of correlations showing that the true Aryans were copper colored, right? The Indo-Europeans, right? Indo is color, black, the darkest color in the light spectrum, right? Indigo, right? That point 12, that Atlantis perished in the terrible convulsion of nature, in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all its inhabitants. Nearly, it says, not all of them, right? That a few persons escaped in ships and on rafts and carried to the nations east and west. East and west, all right? So not just east, so west too. They went to America as well, right? The tidings of appalling catastrophe which has survived to our own time in the flood and deluge legends of the different nations of the old and new worlds. Plato says that in Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire, all right, which aggressed wantonly against the whole Europe and Asia, thus terrifying the extent of its dominion. It not only subjugated Africa as far as Egypt, all right, we're talking about Atlantis, tribes from America, all right, and Europe as far as Italy, but it ruled as well over parts of the continent, to wit, the opposite continent of Americas, which surrounded the true ocean. And when he means true ocean, he's talking about when you cross Atlantis, you get to the true ocean, which is the if you cross America, right, you get to the Pacific Ocean. Those parts of America over which it ruled were, as we will show thereafter, Central America, Peru, and the valley of the Mississippi, occupied by the mound builders. All right. Moreover, he tells us that this vast power was gathered into one, that is to say, from Egypt to Peru, it was one consolidated empire. We will see hereafter that the legends of the Hindus as the Diva Nahusha distinctly refer to this vast empire which covered the whole of the known world. So we've read in these last two books that we can see that America slash Atlantis, right, had a colony established in the other side in Africa, in Egypt, modern day Egypt today, and that's actually was built by Atlanteans or Americans, right? Because when we're talking about prehistory, we're talking about America, right? As the Masons teach each other. So this book correlates with that. I wanted to show you this book. It's called Civilization and the Ancient Egyptians by Katanga A. Bongo, which I believe is an African, but I could be mistaken. So it says in this book, the idea that it was Europeans who introduced civilization to Africa is one of the biggest historical myths. In fact, evidence from archaeology, oral history, traditional languages, and cultural practices strongly indicate that it was the South American Indians. Again, the South American Indians who introduced civilization to Africa. Who introduced civilization to Africa? According to this researcher, South American Indians. Some 7,000 years ago, long before the Greek and Roman civilizations emerged, the South American Indians had introduced civilization to Africa, thereby making Africa the second continent in the world to become civilized. Spurred on by their South American Indian guests, the Africans built great empires that lasted for several thousand years at a time. Contrary to popular myth, in the Western world, the advent of Europeans destroyed civilization in Africa rather than made it. Alright, so as you can see, this researcher is stating what we're correlating about the origins of civilization and where it began. Alright, so all these different scholars are correlating with each other about the antiquity of America, right? The true old world and its ancient civilizations, its ancient peoples. And just to correlate with that, I wanted to read from this book. It's called The American Past, A Survey of American History, Volume 1 to 1877. And so we can see how America also contributed to the rest of the world in another way. And so it says here, feeding the world. America contributed few food animals to world larders, but American plant foods revolutionized European, African, and Asian diets, alright, even African. Maize, Indian corn, and American native astonished Europeans by the height of its stalks and the size of its grain. Cultivation of the crop spread to every continent, increasing the food supply and contributing to the runaway increase in population that characterizes the last 500 years of human history. So you see how important corn was, just corn alone. And if you saw my corn videos, it proves this is the old world. The beginning of a civilization was through agriculture, and you just read it right here in this book. It's telling us because of the increase of food supply that it creates, this plant, this miracle plant, right? The plant of the gods, The sacred tree in a lot of these places in the old world is actually a maize plant or corn plant. All right. So let's continue. It says the sweet potato became a staple in West Africa. All right. So even the sweet potato, it became a staple in West Africa, where it was introduced by slave traders. So it happened the opposite way, he's saying. All right. The jam, superficially similar, was already established there. Okay, so they had jam. It says beans, squash, and pumpkins, peppers, strawberries. There was a European strawberry, but it was inferior to the American. And then vanilla, chocolate, wild rice, and tomatoes are American foods. All those foods you heard, right? That were unknown in Europe, Africa, and Asia before 1492, it says there, right? You know, I highly doubt that, honestly. I know that these foods were probably there longer. I mean, way before 1492, but they did originate from America. Now listen to this part. Of 640 food crops grown in Africa today, almost 600 of them originated in the Americas. Again, of 640 food crops grown in Africa today, almost 600 of them originated in the Americas. So you're saying only 40 of them did not? So 600 of their food crops are American of origin. So what does that tell you? Who is older? Where did it originate? Alright, so who was growing food first? These kind of plants. Who domesticated all these plants first? That means who was doing agriculture first. That means who created the first civilizations. Alright, all correlating, right? It says the manioc, tapioca, also of American origin, is today a staple for 200 million people in the tropics. Again, the manioc, the tapioca, also of American origin, is today a staple for 200 million people in the tropics. The white Irish potato, a native of the Andes, provides basic subsistence for even greater numbers. Alright, so the potato, it's not Irish, it's from here. So I can go on and show you numerous references and correlation that America is proven to be the actual real old world. You know, whether it was a piece of Lemuria and Atlantis all together and only that part sank, or it came after those two sank, but it is, like the book said, one of the first lands out of the primordial waters. America was very ancient. All right. So I wanted you, I know we've been talking about indigenous Aborigines, the copper-colored tribes, in the last 3 videos. But before I continued, and when I want to get into the enslavement of the American Indian, before I continue, I wanted you to have that kind of perspective. This is old. You are old. You are original. You are ancient. This is the true old world. So you got to look at things from that perspective from now on with the rest of the information that I'm going to give you, especially when it comes to slavery. All right? Because you were already over here. You're ancient. All right, so now I want to read from this very good book. It's called Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red Black Peoples. And as you can see the cover here, this is supposed to be Inca chiefs, noble Inca chiefs, right? Don Fran de Orobe, right, is his name, as it says there, with his 2 sons. Alright, so my belly flop right here, it says the fact of relatively small but steady American presence in Africa from at least the early 1500s onwards may well prove to be a vital area for future research, since one would expect to find Native American cultural influences in regions such as Angola, Zaire, and Ghana, Guinea, Cape Verde especially. Alright, again, Cape Verde especially. This is why I've been mentioning Cape Verde a lot. Alright, so from the 1500s onward, you can see a presence, an American presence, right? Native American culture influence in these countries of West Africa, Angola, Zaire, Ghana, Guinea, Cape Verde especially. Remember that, because it's going to be very important when we start hearing about the transatlantic slave trade. It is of course interesting to note that some Africans were already exposed to American cultural influence before leaving Africa. Alright, so before they were leaving Africa, they were already being exposed to American cultural influences. Alright, cultures brought by Africans to the Americas may have already been influenced, especially by Brazilian Native Americans. So he's saying that those that were being brought supposedly from Africa may, it says here, may have been influenced, especially by Brazilian Native Americans. And we're going to read on later how most likely not just influenced but descendants of Brazilian and other Native American people. The extent of such cultural exchange will obviously have to be worked out in careful field research in Angola, Ghana, Guinea, and Cabo Verde, and other places, as well as in archival records. Alright, a little bit more ahead, the author continues, says, long ago, when first working with my own Powhatan Lenape people of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and surrounding areas, I discovered that the meaning of racial terms was a controversial issue. I learned that terms such as mulatto and colored were used or had been used in Virginia in a quite different way from their usage in most books, including modern dictionaries. Alright, so it was being used differently. Alright, those words, remember. In any case, I discovered that Native American descendants had been legally defined as mulattoes in Virginia in 1705 without having any African ancestry. Alright, so, because he's telling us that, dictionaries is basically telling us that it has to be a mixture of a black, or African person with a white ancestry or European ancestry. That's what creates the mulatto, supposedly, or Indian, right? In any case, he says that in 1705 in Virginia, he found the word, or these Native American descendants being called mulattoes without having any African ancestry. Alright? Thus, I knew that the dictionaries were wrong and that there was a lot that was hidden from view by the way most authors had written about the southern United States, about slavery, and about colored people. I later discovered also that the same thing was true as regards the Caribbean, Brazil, and much of the rest of the Americas. Alright, so this word mulattoes was being applied to Indians, but it didn't mean they were mixed with African ancestry. Basically, that's what he's trying to let you know. And further on in this book, it says, as the reader will see, there is hardly a racial term which has a clear and consistent meaning over time and space. For example, the term Indian, or Indio, has been applied to many peoples, including the Indians of South Asia, as well as all groups found in the West Indies, the Americas, and the East Indies, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, etc. The term Negro has been applied to black Africans, the Indians of India, Native Americans. Okay, Negro has been applied to Native Americans. Okay, Japanese and slaves of whatever ancestry. Black has been used for all of the above and for non-whites in general. Alright, non-whites in general. A crayon color, black. By way of illustration and attempting to grapple with the problem of black African Native American mixture, and especially with the question of to what extent African Americans throughout the Americas are part American Indian, it is first necessary to focus upon a clarification of such racial or ethnic terms as were used in the colonial and early national periods. The key terms include mulatto, pardo, colored, free colored, negro, Zambo or Sambo, Musti, and Mestizo. Alright, this is very important words as he's saying, because we always have a certain perspective when we hear mulatto, when we hear colored, right? Or free colored, when we hear Negro or Sambo, they're always throwing that African. But like he's saying, we have to be very careful into seeing how much so-called African Americans throughout the Americas are part American Indian. We really have to understand these words they were using back then. Moreover, it has also been assumed that terms such as free Negro and free colored can be used interchangeably, and that one could in more recent usage substitute free black for either of these. Alright, so they're basically telling you that they're just talking about people of color, right? Dark-skinned people, black people as they call them. They were free Negro or free colored, right? The same thing. Down below it says many colored terms such as dark, Swarty, there we go again, Swarty, we learned that in the first parts, and brown are also quite ambiguous, as should be obvious. In a 1756 list of militiamen in King Queen County, Virginia, for example, one finds an appellation to a fair-complexioned person, Thomas Delaney, as dark. Benjamin Wilson as dark, James Wilson Moore as brown, John Major as brown, John Kemp as swarthy, but with light hair and freckles, John Evans as dark, and Richard Riddle as dark. Most of these men were born in Virginia, and several were planters. Were they part American or part African? Certainly, we cannot judge their race from such color reference alone. All right, so you hear what he's saying. We can't just assume that they were African just because they were being, just because of the way they were being referenced in terms of color, right? Basically tells us here that the primary purpose of this study is not to write a comprehensive account of Native American African relations, but rather to establish a sound empirical and conceptual basis for further study in this area, and more importantly, to demonstrate beyond any doubt that all the assumptions must be set aside. All right, all the assumptions. He says this latter is especially true as regards the extent of Native American African mixture and the significant genetic contributions of Americans to present-day Black or Afro-American populations in the Caribbean, Brazil, the United States, and elsewhere. All right. So he wants to set clear that you got to research that there could have been a large influence of American people or American culture into West Africa, right? Not just the other way around. So he begins his book in chapter 1. It's talking about Africans and Americans intercontinental contacts across the Atlantic to 1500. It is now well known that the Atlantic Ocean contains a series of powerful rivers or currents which can facilitate the movement of floating objects from the Americas to Europe and Africa, as well as from the latter to the Americas. In the North Atlantic, the most prominent current is that of the Gulf Stream, which swings through the Caribbean and then moves in a northeasterly direction from Florida to the Grand Banks of Terra Nova or Newfoundland, turning then eastward towards the British Isles and the Bay of Biscay, that's in Europe. This current has carried debris from Jamaica and the Caribbean to the Hebrides and Orkneys of Scotland. Alright, so it says that this current, again, you didn't hear, is that it can carry debris from all the way, in Jamaica, all the way to Europe. Alright, without no paddles, without, nobody taking it over there. Just by floating, it's getting to Europe from Jamaica debris. Alright. Moreover, Jean Marion tells us the valuable hardwood was commonly washed ashore along the coast of Ireland and Wales. This timber from the ocean borne by the Gulf Stream really came from the rivers of Mexico. Alright. Marion, a student of transatlantic navigation by small vessels, also states that the first success of crossing the Atlantic by one man could only come from the American side. Again, the first success of crossing the Atlantic by one man could only come from the American side, because the crossing is much less difficult in that direction. A French writer has said justly, in all probability, that if America had been the old world, its inhabitants would have discovered Europe long before we did, in fact, discover America. So this French guy is clearly telling us that if America is the old world, and we know it is, right, that its inhabitants would have discovered Europe long before we did, all right, or Africa, as we read in the last book, right, that from the African writer of South American Indians civilizing Egypt or Africa. This is because of the prevailing winds from the west as well as the currents. One can, says Marion, sail in a straight line from Boston via Newfoundland to Ireland or Cornwall with almost the certainty of fair winds. The other direction requires twice the distance, thrice the time, 4 times the sweat. So you're hearing this, right? So it's a lot harder to come from that side of the earth, from Europe, West Africa to America. It's a lot easier to go from this side to that side, all right? It's less work with fair winds on your back, all right? So you can sail over there without paddles. In this context, it is also worth noting a report that Columbus had information about strange people from the west who had reached Ireland prior to 1492. doubtless via the Gulf Stream. Marion tells us that Bartholomew or Christopher Columbus had made marginal notes in their copy of Pius II's Historia 1477 to the effect that some men have come from Cathay by heading east. We have seen more than one remarkable thing, especially in Galway and Ireland. Two people tied to two wrecks, a man and a woman, a superb creature. Marion also believes that the first documented case of single navigator crossing the Atlantic consists in record of a Native American who reached the Iberian Peninsula long before Columbus' day. And here's the account. It says, in the Middle Ages, there arrived one day on the coast of Spain a man, red and strange, red, right? Copper colored, in a craft described as a hollowed tree or canoe, right? From the recorded description, which specifically states that he was not a Negro, he might well have been a native of America in a piragua, a dugout canoe. The unfortunate man, ill and enfeebled, died before he had been taught to make himself understood. Alright, so they couldn't get who he was supposedly. Bartolomé de las Casas, in his monumental Historia de las Indias, cites examples of rafts or canoes, almadias, dead Americans and their breed reaching the Azores Islands before 1492. Alright, so Bartolomé de las Casas, in all these voyage, transatlantic voyage and discovery years and times, he has a lot of input in a lot of the books, the historical books. He gets quoted a lot, so he's telling us that there's evidence of dead Americans, debris reaching Azores Islands before 1492. This evidence will be discussed below. Here it is only necessary to note that the Azores lay in an area weak of currents, but that even so, with the help of winds from the west and northwest, some boats could have reached the islands from the Americas. And continuing, it says, of course, one of the problems with the argument for early transatlantic crossings is that in the modern period, such islands as Iceland, Bermuda, the Azores, the Madeiras, the Cabo Verdes, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, and even Sao Tome of Nigeria and Cameroon were uninhabited prior to the documented Irish, Norse, and Portuguese occupations. On the other hand, some of these islands are small or far from major currents. Bartolomé de las Casas states that the Azores were the Islas Cassiterides mentioned by Strabo in his geography, and which islands were repeatedly visited by the Carthaginians. Allegedly, there lived in the Azores a people who were of Loro or Baso color. That is to say, people of the color of Native Americans, or intermediate between white and black. The Canary Islands were inhabited in the 15th century by people who were isolated from nearby Africa, and whose cultures somewhat resembled those of some Americans. Alright, so look, so there's evidence there of these West African islands, right? Places of a lot of American influence, cultural influence there. Moreover, the personal names of the many Canarios enslaved by the Spanish have decidedly American ring about them. Although such resemblances do not always mean a great deal, the Canarios are sometimes described as Loro, or brownish colored people in the slave registers. So the Canarios are, brownish colored people or copper colored people, right? The fact that the islands of Cabo Verde and Madeira were uninhabited in the 15th century does indeed pose a problem for African navigation to the Americas. So they're saying, because there was no people there, so, who was really going back and forth first? Because we know that in the Americas, it was populated since ancient times, right? However, that will be discussed later. He says, now it is necessary to consider briefly evidence relating to the maritime capabilities of Americans in the late 15th century to see whether voyages across the Atlantic might have been feasible. It says, the Americans of the Caribbean region were outstanding navigators and seamen, as noted by the Spaniards and other Europeans. Christopher Columbus was impressed everywhere by their skill. He noted, for example, that their boats, barcos and barquillos, which they called canoas or canoes, were excellently made from a single tree, were very large and long, carrying sometimes 40 to 45 men, 2 or more kodos, perhaps a man's breadth in width. The American boats were unsinkable. All right, again, the American boats were unsinkable. And if in a storm they happened to capsize, the sailors simply turned them back over while swimming in the sea, bailing them out with gourds carried for that purpose. Andres Bernaldez recorded from Columbus that the Americans navigated in their canoes with exceptional agility and speed, with 60 to 80 men in them, each with an oar. 60 to 80 men, and they went by sea 150 leagues or more. They were masters of the sea. A canoe was later discovered in Jamaica, which was 96 feet long, 8 feet broad, made from a single tree. That is huge. All right. So we got Columbus. Uh, so we got this account of Columbus, saying how the agility and the speed of the canoes. They could carry 80 men. They were masters of the sea. This is in Columbus' words, masters of the sea. And they even found one in Jamaica, 96 feet long. That's long, right? Columbus found that the Lucayo people of the Bahamas were not only very well acquainted with Cuba, 1.5 days away with canoe, but also knew that from Cuba it was 10 days' journey to the mainland, doubtless Mexico or South America, since Florida would have been closer than that. He also saw a boat which was 95 palms long, in which 150 persons could be contained and navigate. 150 persons? Come on, that's a ship. Yeah, right? Like these Spanish and Portuguese ships that contain those many people. This is basically a ship, right? 95 palms long, it says. 150 persons. You can put 100. Did they ever tell you in school that the Indians made canoes that can fit 150 people? That's a ship, all right? So I'm picturing like these Phoenician type ships, with this just paddles, right? How they draw the Phoenician ships. All right, so because we're gonna read that they even had sails over here. It says, others were seen which were of great workmanship and beauty, being expertly carved. A canoe was also seen being navigated successfully by one man in high winds and rough sea. At Haiti, Columbus learned that the island of Jamaica was 10 days' journey distant from the mainland and that the people there were closed, thus referring to Mexico or Yucatan most likely. In another place he learned of a land 100 leagues away where gold was mined. The Arawak and Carib-speaking people of the Caribbean were well informed geographically. Columbus captured Caribs in the Antilles, such as Guadeloupe, from whom he learned of the South American mainland, but he also learned of the mainland from Americans living on St. Croix and Borinquen, Puerto Rico. Americans who were taken into Europe drew maps there which showed Haiti, Cuba, and the Bahamas, as well as many other islands and countries which were named in the native language. So the Indians taught Columbus and these Europeans about the rest of the islands. That's how they found them so easy. And continuing in this book, it says, even more significant for our purposes is the fact that when the Spaniards reached Yucatan in 1517, they saw 10 large canoes called piraguas, full of Indians from the town, approaching us with oars and sails. The canoes were large ones made like hollow throws, cleverly cut out from huge single logs, and many of them would hold 40 Indians. The fact that these boats were equipped with sails is indeed interesting because it means that wind power could be used to run against currents or to navigate rapidly even where currents were lacking. Clinton R. Edwards also cites other evidence documenting the use of sails by Carib and other American peoples in the Caribbean and Ecuadorian North Peruvian sailors in the Pacific, both at the time of initial Spanish contact. An example of the navigation capabilities of the Caribbean natives, we can cite the case in 1516 when 70 or 80 Spaniards in a Carabel Bergantine brig sailed from Santiago de Cuba to Waxala, Honduras, now Roatan. There they enslaved many Guanaxa people and carried them in the Carabel to Havana, Cuba. All right, so they enslaved Indians, right? In 1516, the Waxana people, and carried them to Havana, right? So remember that. The Americans were subsequently able to overcome their Spanish guards, seizing the sail ships and hiciéndose de la vela, cual si fueran expertos navegantes, volvieron a su patria. So it's saying basically that they took over the ship, these Indians, right? These Guanaxa people from Honduras, right? It's probably most likely so-called Negroes, right? They took over the ship and they went back, right? And so we got accounts, we saw part 3, that rebellious slaves, right? Negro slaves took over some ships and shipwrecked of the Mosquito Coast, right? And that was in Honduras as well. So we always got to make sure when they're talking about some Africans, took over ship, were these really Africans? There was actually Indians that were being enslaved by Spanish and Portuguese peoples, and then later on in history, they tell us that these were Africans, right? Because they were black. But you can see here clearly that Indians took over ships and even took them back to their land. It says they were able to sail from Havana to Honduras, a distance of more than 200 leagues in a European vessel with no assistance from any non-Americans, and this after having been kept below the decks during their journey to Havana. So they knew how to sail, basically, is what he's trying to say. The navigational capabilities of the Americans of the Caribbean Mexican coastal area extend back well into pre-Columbian times, as attested to by pictures of boats found in various codices, murals, and sculptured walls in the Mexico-Yucatan region. In about the 10th century AD, also the Mexican leader Quetzalcoatl is recorded as having sailed with a raft to the east, rising sun from the Gulf Coast of central Mexico. Along the Atlantic coast of North America, Americans also went out to sea. On the South Carolina coast, for example, the Seawee outfitted boats with sails, and on one occasion a group of natives decided to visit England. They outfitted a canoe with sails and went out into the Atlantic, but were picked up by British vessel and sold as slaves. Alright, again, some Indians that were navigating, they were heading to England, were captured on the open sea by British vessel and sold as slaves. So when they were coming back, they would most likely said they were African. That's what they told people, or that's what they teach you in history today. And I actually went to the footnote of this book, and it's from a book called A New Voyage to Carolina, written in 1709 by John Lawson. So it's actually in there, that account. A lot of these I'm using this book on purpose because he's referencing a lot of his sources are accurate. I went to verify them. So he has all this information in his book. So, I'm reading off of his book, but these are actual verifiable sources he's using. To the south along the Brazilian coast, the Portuguese and other Europeans also witnessed American navigation at sea. An Italian traveling with Magellan in 1519 noted that the Brazilian boats were made from the trunk of a tree and were so large that each boat held 30 to 40 men. In the 1550s, Hans Staden noted that the dugout boats of the Santos, Rio de Janeiro area could hold up to 30 men, were 4 feet in width, and with some being larger and some smaller. And these they move rapidly with oars, navigating with them as far as they wish. When the sea is rough, they take the canoes ashore until good weather comes again. They do not go more than 2 leagues straight out to the sea, but along the coast they navigate far. In 1565, the Jesuit Jose de Anchieta stated that the Americans of the same region had dozens or more canoes made from a single tree, with other pieces of the same cutting used as boards, well attached with vines. They were large enough to carry 20 to 25 persons with their arms and supplies, and some held up to 30 persons. With these boats they were able to cross such fierce bravas seas that it is a frightful thing and not to be imagined or believed without seeing. Anchieta also noted that if the canoes turned over, the navigators simply bailed out the boat, turned it right side up, and carried on. Thus the Brazilian boats were also very well made, were very fast and maneuverable, and could be righted at sea if necessary. They were used to carry warriors and supplies over considerable distances along the coast, as far as, for example, from Santos San Vicente to Rio de Janeiro. In general, it would appear that the Americans of the Caribbean built the biggest boats and were most accustomed to going far out to sea, while the Atlantic coastal groups were more oriented to staying within a certain distance of land, 6 miles or so. On the other hand, all were capable of being carried out to sea by strong winds and currents and yet survive in rough water. It should also be noted that several groups along the Pacific coast manufactured seaworthy craft and were capable of reaching Polynesia by means of favorable currents. It is beyond the scope of this study to discuss such voyages, but one must note that the many Pacific island peoples may very well be of American ancestry, mixed with varying proportions of Oceanic Negro African with a question mark and Malayo-Indonesian stocks. All right, so they put it in parentheses and they put African question mark because they don't really know if they're African just because they're Negro, right? So we correlated from, I believe, video 1 and 2 that there's a lot of Polynesian features in the Californian, right, in the Mexican. So this is correlating with that. All right. So as you can see, Americans were very capable of crossing the sea, going out to the open ocean. As all these accounts just told us, and even Columbus himself told us, especially with the western winds and Gulf Stream and currents in their favor. Even if they didn't plan to and got lost at sea and ended up on the other side of Europe or shipwrecked, still, like the book said, like we just read, that if anybody ever did the transatlantic crossing or the Atlantic crossing, it would be from the America's side. This is the old world, Antediluvian. As you see, they had colonies on that side of the world, in Egypt all the way into Italy, in the Mediterranean. Alright, Atlantis / America, like we read. We see that we had the oldest Y chromosome here found. It predates over 200,000 years old. The genetic atom that was supposedly in Africa. It predates. Alright, we have the oldest pyramids. We have agriculture, the oldest mummies. We saw that a lot of the foods in Africa, 600 of them are from America, the food crops. Alright, we saw that in Brazil. Clearly they found Negroid skeletons and people living there, that had nothing to do with Africa. Look more like Southeast Asian, Polynesian actually. So again, we're gonna get into the enslavement of the Native American, the antediluvian, the ancient ones from this true old world, the people who lived on this side. So before I do, I wanted to talk about, show you something basically. Was this a random act that happened that Europeans, like they tell us, Columbus got lost and he made it to America and then he started enslaving everybody, right? As we're about to read. Was this just a random thing that happened? Or was your enslavement strategically planned and given permission and authority by those in power in that time? So I want you to focus on this document right here. Well, we're going to talk about the different Papal bulls, right, that they had given these conquistadors, these settlers, these privateers as they call them, permission to invade and put you in perpetual servitude. As it says here, it says dum diversas. It says dum diversas in English means until different. Means that it hasn't gone away. It hasn't changed. So it's going on still right now because until different. This hasn't changed. This dum diversas, this Papal bull that I'm about to read you, has not changed. You're still in perpetual servitude. Alright, so let's read. And it says here in Wikipedia, dum diversas is a Papal bull issued on the 18th of June of 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. So this is way before Columbus came, right? 1452, Columbus came in 1492. Alright, 40 years before. It says, it is authorized Alonso V of Portugal to conquer Saracens and pagans and to consign them to perpetual servitude. Alright, so Saracens and pagans, this is a very broad statement I'm going to show you. Alright, so dum diversas was a Papal bull. Alright, so let's see what the Encyclopedia Britannica online tells us about what is a papal bull. It says in Roman Catholicism, an official papal letter or document, official. The name is derived from the lead seal bulla, traditionally affixed to such documents. Since the 12th century has designated a letter from the Pope carrying a bulla that shows the heads of the apostles Peter and Paul on one side and the Pope's signature on the other. And down below it says, by the 13th century, the term papal bull referred to only the most important documents issued by the Pope. These included canonizations of saints, dogmatic pronouncements, Henry VIII's dispensation to Mary Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, the restoration of the Society of Jesus in 1814, and the announcement of December 25, 1961 of the forthcoming Second Vatican Council. Alright, so these are very important official letters. So the Dum Diversas is an official, very important letter from the Pope. Alright, so we have the Dum Diversas, and now we also have the Pontifex Romanus, which I'm about to read, which is basically the same. It's like an upgrade. Alright, I'm going to read to you from the Papal Encyclicals Online, your guide to online papal and other official documents of the Catholic Church. So this is, I'm going to read for you from the actual letter. Alright, I'm going to belly flop to some parts, obviously. So it says here, Romanus Pontifex, granting the Portuguese a perpetual monopoly in trade with Africa, January 8, 1455. The Bull Romanus Pontifex, Nicholas V, January 8, 1455, says background. The kingdoms of Portugal and Castile had been jockeying for position and possession of colonial territories along the African coast for more than a century prior to the Columbus discovery of lands in the western seas. On the theory that the Pope was an arbitrator between nations, each kingdom had sought and obtained papal bulls at various times to bolster its claim on the grounds that its activities served to spread Christianity. So even in their website here is telling us that they were just looking for an excuse to go do what they were doing in these foreign lands, right? Their so-called excuse was to spread Christianity. All right, is basically they're telling you right here it was just to bolster its claims. They weren't really just spreading Christianity. We know that already, right? The Bull Romanus Pontifex is an important example of the papacy's claim to spiritual lordship of the whole world and of its role in regulating relations among Christian princes and between Christians and unbelievers, in parentheses, right? Heathens and infidels, parentheses, right? That's very broad. Of course, you don't accept Christ, right? What happens? You're considered an unbeliever, a heathen, and an infidel. So, all right. This bull became the basis for Portugal's later claim to the lands in the New World. All right. So this bull became the basis for Portugal's later claim to the lands in the New World. And we're going to read not only Portugal but Spain, right? A claim which was countered by Castile, right? Spain, and the bull Inter Caetera in 1493. An English translation of Romanus Pontifex is reproduced below, as published in European treatises bearing on the history of the United States and its dependencies to 1648. Francis Gardiner Davenport, editor, Carnegie Institute of Washington, 1917, Washington, D.C. Alright, the original text in Latin is in the same volume on page 13 and 20. And it continues here, a little below, it says, English translation, Nicholas, Bishop, servant of the servants of God for perpetual remembrance. The Roman Pontiff, successor of the key bearer of the heavenly kingdom and vicar of Jesus Christ. So, vicar of Jesus Christ, if you don't know what that means, it means that the Pope, his title is the vicar of Jesus Christ, meaning he is the representative of Jesus on earth. So he's supposed to be like Jesus on earth. Contemplating with Father's mind all the several climes of the world and the characteristics of the nations, dwelling in them and seeking and desiring the salvation of all, wholesomely ordains and disposes upon careful deliberation those things which he sees will be agreeable to the divine majesty, and by which he may bring the sheep entrusted to him by God into the single divine fold, and may acquire for them the reward of eternal felicity, and obtain pardon for their souls. Alright, so basically they're saying that, whatever they need to do to Christianize, evangelize these so-called infidels, right? These pagans, these heathens, slash you, the Native American, that's what they called you. They're saying it's for divine majesty and hopefully they can obtain pardon for their souls because of what they're about to go do, murder. This we believe will more certainly come to pass through the aid of the Lord, if we bestow suitable favors and special graces on those Catholic kings and princes, who like athletes and intemperate champions of the Christian faith, as we know by the evidence of facts, not only restrain the savage excesses of the Saracens and other infidels, enemies of the Christian name, but also for the defense and increase of the faith, vanquish them and their kingdoms and habitations. Alright, again, the enemies of the Christian name, right? This is to vanquish them and their kingdoms and habitations, though situated in the remotest parts unknown to us. Alright, so this is in 1455, right? 1452 to 1455. Yet they told us Columbus was lost, but yet they know that there's infidels and heathens, right? Situated in the remotest parts unknown to them, right? So they know America's over there. They're clearly telling you right here. And subject them to their own temporal dominion. Subject them to their own temporal dominion, sparing no labor and expense, in order that those kings and princes, relieved of all obstacles, may be more animated to the prosecution of so salutary and laudable a work. Alright, so if you read between the lines what they're trying to say, right? Alright, so let's continue. So the most important part of these Papal bulls from 1452 and 1455 is what I'm about to read right now, where it clearly tells you what they're going to go do. Therefore, and when they say we, he's talking about the Pope and his people right next to him, the people with authority, right? The Roman Catholics, Vatican Empire. It says we, therefore, weighing all in singular the premises with due meditation, and nothing that since we had formerly by other letters of our granted, among other things, free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ whatsoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So you see how he's describing them, right? So they tell us that the Native Americans were savages, right? They were walking around naked, they didn't have no kingdoms or anything like that. But right here clearly it's telling us that these enemies of Christ, right, they want to vanquish and subdue them whatsoever placed, and their kingdoms, their dukedoms, principalities, dominions, and possessions, right? And to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. You still a slave. And to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. All right, so after taking all their kingdoms and dukedoms and all that that's over there, I guess, you know, he's giving them authority to basically appropriate or keep that, give it to his successors, or any other conquistadors coming here. They were able to keep these things and give it to their successors because the Pope gave them permission. All right, by having secured the said faculty, the said King Alfonso, or by his authority, the aforesaid Infante, justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed, and thus possessed these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alonso and his successors. Nor without special license from King Alfonso and his successors themselves has any other even of the faithful of Christ been entitled hitherto, nor is he by any means now entitled lawfully to meddle therewith. Alright, so as you can see, reading between the lines, they had full permission to go enslave you, copper-colored tribe of America, so-called Negro, Antediluvian, Aboriginal. They had permission and authority from the Pope to go enslave you, to take your kingdoms, your dukedoms, your principalities, your dominions, your possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by you, and to reduce you, your person, to perpetual slavery. Alright? You. So it wasn't a random act. Columbus never got lost. All right, we need to understand this. All right, so before I got into the enslavement of the Native American, we know why it happened. All right, they were authorized to do this. They knew what they were coming here to do. All right, so in reference to them knowing what they were coming to do here in America, that includes, Columbus' voyage, right? So there is a book called the Book of Prophecies written by Christopher Columbus himself. You can find this book in the Biblioteca Colombina in Seville, Spain. So the Biblioteca Colombina, or the Columbine, right? The Columbus voyages, or anything to do with the Spanish conquest of the New World, or their voyages of all the Spaniards. All these accounts, all these books are in the Biblioteca Colombina in Seville. We will see the significance of Seville later on, how it was a slave market for Native Americans. And when they were brought over there, they were being sold as Negroes in Seville, Native Americans. All right, so let's look into this book real. I want to show you something. So it says here, among the earliest and most fascinating witnesses to the latter is a manuscript of 84 folios dated between September 13th, 1501 and March 23rd, 1502, and now preserved in the Biblioteca Colombina in Sevilla. It begins, "This is the beginning of the book or collection of authoritates, sayings, opinions, and prophecies concerning the need to recover the holy city and Mount Zion." Again, Columbus is telling us that this is the beginning of the book or collections, right? Of the prophecies concerning the need to recover the holy city and Mount Zion. And he's talking about America, right? And the discovery and conversion of the islands of the Indies and all of peoples and nations for Ferdinand and Isabella, our Spanish rulers. This manuscript, commonly known as El Libro de Prophecies, the Book of Prophecies, was compiled by Christopher Columbus himself in collaboration with Gaspar Gorizio, a Carthusian monk of Italian origin who belonged to the monastery of Santa Maria de las Cuevas in Seville. So again, not only did they know that there was people over here and what they were going to do to these people, they knew who these people were, who you were, right? So we have records of Columbus stating that he's coming to recover the holy city and Mount Zion, and we know from our studies, and all the knowledge we've gathered from the different scholars, right, in those last couple of years, that Peru, right, contains Cusco, and Cusco is appearing to be, and most likely was, ancient Jerusalem, and Mount Zion, or the city of David, was Sacsayhuaman, right there, right next to Cusco. All right, so they knew, there's evidence here that where there's written accounts where Columbus brought a Hebrew translator with him to talk to the Indians, and he came looking for the Grand Khan, right? All right, the Grand Khan. All right, so even though, I'm just scratching the surface here, and, I have much more I can show. It would take hours though, all the correlation that exists, that, you can see who you are, how ancient you are, where is the true old world, who was over here. I hope in these last 4 parts of this video series you can kind of get that clear, or at least put it in your mind so you can research it and study it yourself, debunk me, prove it wrong, try to correlate yourself. I can't do this alone, and I haven't done this alone. I've been learning from many scholars. There's so many to name right now, but I'm glad, I thank Hawa for allowing me to come across them, because it's helped me, have a clear perspective of a foundational truth. So just gonna finish up this video with some more correlation, telling us who was here when the explorers and conquistadors and all these early settlers came, who they were encountering. Alright, so let's continue with the video. So I'm just going to read from this book. It's called The American Nations, or Outlines of Their General History, Ancient and Modern. And it's a very long title, by C.S. Rafinsky, 1836. So I'm just going to go to this part of the book where he's talking about Atlantis, and he's quoting Diodorus. Alright, it says here, the Phoenicians, driven by a storm while going from Gadis to Africa, discovered the large island Atlantis, many days in the ocean west of Libya. Many days in the ocean west of Libya. It was very fruitful, with mountains, large plains, and navigable rivers, with many woods and fruits, fine valleys, plenty of wild beasts and fish. The air is mild and healthful. It is residence fit for gods. The inhabitants are a strong and healthful people. Alright, so you hear who's living in Atlantis / America, right? Do you remember from earlier, right? Healthful people, the residents of the gods, strong. They have many towns with stately buildings, houses of pleasures, gardens, and orchards, alright? Just like the dumb diversas said, your kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, right? And the book continues stating, what they think about this statement Diodorus made. It says, the translators of Diodorus have blundered so far as to deem this island Madeira, or the Canaries, which are small islands without streams, and the first without inhabitants. Right? If you remember earlier, all these islands on the west coast were supposed to be uninhabited, so it makes the transatlantic travel from that side to America difficult, if we remember from earlier, right? Africans and Native Americans. So it can only apply to Haiti, it says here. It can only apply to Haiti, or even the continent of South America. All right, Atlantis. Event 49, it says, a black people came to Haiti from the south or southeast, who had darts of guanine metal and were called the Black Guaninis. This tradition, preserved by Herrera, Garcia, and Charlevoix, indicates a colony of Negroes or men painted black from South America. They might be the black Negroes of Cuarenqua, mentioned by Dangleria, or some other American Negro nation, of which there are many. Again, they might be some other American Negro nation, of which there are many black nations. See my account of ancient black nations of America, says the author. Continuing, it says, Dangleria mentions 2 wild tribes of savages in Haiti towards 1500, one speechless, which means they spoke a different language, probably a remain of the Caracols, another swift dwelling in caves, quite apart, seen in 1514 in Suana of Guanacarima. The 15th event says here. Navigations of the Haitians and Cubans, settlements of the Lucayas, islands, Jamaica, and probably some parts of Florida. Mutual trade with Cuba and the continent. Alright, so they're saying how they're getting around in that area, right? And we learned earlier about their capability to go to the open sea, and probability that they were the first to cross the Atlantic and get to Europe and Africa, right? And colonize and civilize Africa, as we remember earlier from that author, right? So continue, says, these colonial and trading voyages must have begun long before and have been continual. Columbus met individuals in Cuba who had visited Haiti, Jamaica, and Jamaya. That's another word right there, Jamaya, the Maya land, or Yucatan. Yucayas or Lucayans knew Cuba, Haiti, and Florida, which was called Cautio, says Fulger, quoted by Cardenas, who deemed the Antilles people from hence, blending it with Cauta, the original seat of the Haitians. South America was so called Guanin, afterwards Caribana, when it was overspread by the Carib tribes. The Natchez appear to have come from Cuba, so the Natchez originate from Cuba according to this researcher. The Cumanas knew Haiti and called it Atsi. In another part of the book, this book, it says, American anthropography will teach that there were men of all sizes, features, and complexions in this hemisphere before 1492, many complexions. Notwithstanding the false assertions of many writers who take one nation for the whole American group, the Ushiks, the Puruais, the Parias, the Shons, were as white as the Spaniards. All right, so these tribes that were here were really light-skinned and white as Spaniards, right? 50 such tribes were found in South America. All right, so there's 50 white tribes in South America were found. So who were these tribes, right? We know there was many tribes over here, many peoples, right? A mixed multitude. Abyssinia means a mixed multitude of peoples, right? The old word for Ethiopia, right? Where dark-skinned people live, because it says here, while many tribes of Shoko, and now they mean so-called Negro or so-called black, the Manabis, the Yaruras, were as black as Negroes. All the other shades of brown, tawny, and coppery were scattered everywhere. Again, all the other shades of brown, tawny, and coppery were scattered everywhere. There was not a single red man in America unless painted such. So he's telling you straight up, you know, how they incorrectly call it red, but they really just mean all the other shades of brown, right? From Negro, tawny, and coppery, scattered everywhere, as he says there. Some tribes had scanty beards, as the Tartars, Chinese, Berbers. Others bushy beards. Alright? The Tinguis or Patagons were 7 to 8 feet high, and the Guaymas only 4 to 5 feet. Alright, so different kinds of people on this side. This is the old world, people. You need to understand that you did live here amongst other tribes. So, you know, even though they try to mix all the Indians into one group, there was really many nations, alright, many tribes, and you know, some shows up, some didn't. So this is in reference to the Atacapa Native Americans. It says here Atacapa Trace Junction. Portion of historical Atacapa trails connecting their Southeast Texas bands, Sunset People, to Southwest Louisiana bands, Sunrise People, or East and West, right? Especially the Opelousas band, composed of 6 bands. The Atacapas, a Choctaw name, called themselves Ishak, the people. So they called themselves Ishak. That sounds a lot like Isaac, the people of Isaac, Ishak. Alright, let's continue. So I'm going to read from this book. It's called Lake Charles Atacapas, or Cannibals in parentheses as they call them, right? Period of 1817 to 1820, written by the request for the Howard Memorial Library, New Orleans, by Dr. J.O. Dyer, Galveston, Texas, 1917. It was in the year 1819 when an American officer entered Lake Charles village of the Atacapas on a cold October day. Colonel Graham had been on official business at the Lafitte camp at Galveston and was making his way from Bolivar by land to the Vermilion Bridge. An attack of acute dysentery compelled Graham to spend a week at the village, and thus we have an interesting description handed down to us. Graham became later associated at New Orleans with the writer's father. The savages, who were the coastal clan of interior tribes, were a very low type of civilization. They were dark-skinned with dirty, short, coarse, black, matted hair. Again, dark-skinned with dirty, short, coarse, black, matted hair, matted, coarse. Their bodies stout, stature short, and heads of large size, placed almost between the shoulders. The ears were very large, as were the mouths, and the cheekbones and nose prominent. Colonel Graham thought they resembled the Orcoquisas, so that means that the Orcoquisas had Negro features as well, right? But they were much stouter and their necks shorter. Fish oil was used as a food, consequently they were extremely fat, and the custom of oiling their bodies added to the sleekness. So they were dark-skinned with short, matted, black, coarse hair, right? Alright, so this is a painting you can, or a drawing of them. You can also find this on Wikipedia. It says details from a drawing by De Bertz in 1735, the Atacapas, as you can see, so-called Negro. So this is a good time to end this. I hope it wasn't too long or boring for you. Hope you liked it, and we made a lot of correlation, hopefully. I would love it if you continue the journey with me, if you stay tuned for part 5 of this series. I am going to go into the enslavement of the Native American. I know I have said that a lot, but before I get there, I have to make certain things clear because we're gonna, put two and two together, right? So now that we know this is the old world and that you're ancient, and with you civilizations began, agriculture, all right, writing, kingdoms, all right, and now that you know that they came here strategically to get rid of you, to put you in perpetual slavery and servitude, you know what what are you waiting for? Remember, dumb diversas mean until different. You still a slave. Roman Catholic, right? Rome still rules. They conquered, right? All right. So much blessings, much ahab for taking the time to watch this video and be here with me, taking this journey. I appreciate all the supportive comments everyone has left. I really, really appreciate it. Truly, I'm glad everyone is liking it, and the time has come. So again, thanks for being here. Stay tuned for part 5.